Welcome back to The Man Who Tried to Fake an Element by BobbyBroccoli. This is part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, I'll pin it in the description. Please be sure to watch it first. Let's get right into it.
And there was nowhere else to go except further and further up. As of 1945, the 4 earlier gaps in the table had been filled. Elements 43, 87, 85, and 61 had all been isolated. If there were more elements...
I have to say, I just love his presentation style to this. It's very chill and very easy to follow with this sort of thing. And I've never really seen anything like this we haven't even gotten into the guy who tried to fake anything yet, and we're just talking about the historical development of the periodic table. And this is fascinating.
out there, it was only going to get harder and harder to find them. From this point on, they would come to be known as the Super Heavies. As for Glenn Seaborg, he was once again going where the tides of life took him. His career took a turn when he received an out-of-the-blue phone call from John F. Kennedy, of all people. He was about to be named the next head of the Atomic Energy Commission. Later, he would become a close confidant of Lyndon B. Johnson, and they were apparently such good friends that Seaborg was regularly invited to the White House to just come hang out and chat. After he had made the fuel for the first atomic bomb, Seaborg would push hard for treaties that would limit the spread of nukes. This is not an attempt to absolve him of his role in that, but I think it's important to fully contextualize it.
It's interesting that a lot of the people who worked on the Manhattan Project, because once they realized what they were making and the implications and leading into an arms race, I mean, they felt that. I mean, wouldn't you? Knowing that you're going to trigger this crazy sort of weapons thing, like you could have just been into this strictly for the science, pulling off something like that. Hey, just doing something to help win World War II, but you see what happened after the fact. I'm not surprised. That's a very human response.
This is where Seaborg diverges from our story, but Berkeley does not. Every element in the streak from 93 to 101 had been discovered by a team with some sort of tie to Berkeley.
Okay.
From this point on, it would not be so clear-cut, and the controversy would play out on a geopolitical scale. There are a lot of famous Einstein quotes out there, but there is one I saw for the very first time while researching this video. This is what Einstein had to say on the topic of making new elements. It would be like shooting birds at night, in a country with not that many birds. So true, bestie. And he's not wrong. Element hunting is essentially like gambling. The basic setup is easy enough to describe. You have a target and you have a bullet. Except both the target and the bullet are so small they're invisible, and also the target is almost certainly radioactive. And even if you do make a direct hit, there's a good chance you'll break apart or even destroy parts of your target.
What he means by radioactive making it harder is that the target's not going to last very long, especially when you get into these super crazy elements that, like he showed on his little chart, that are just there for the order of milliseconds. And keep in mind, this is back in a time period where you didn't have super fast electronics that could recognize everything and report it back to you quickly. One of the things, like during, I talked about this in my Chernobyl review, was that their computers back then were, and this is the 80s we're talking about, were so slow that they would tell you about what's happening in the core minutes after it already happened. So minutes away when seconds count in that sort of scenario. So you can imagine dealing with slow computers and slow devices on something where you have milliseconds to work with when creating these new elements. It's crazy.
So this is less like aiming a gun at a target and more like a game of roulette with the absolute worst odds imaginable. If you take just one spin, the odds of hitting the exact right pocket are not good.
So that's actually what nuclear physics really is. It's a Monte Carlo simulation. That's what it all is. Whether it be for decay, for fission, for, in this case, neutron capture. In fact, the odds you're dealing with, there's a weird unit from this that came from the Manhattan Project called a barn. A barn is 10 to the minus 28 square meters. The expression "can't hit the broadside of a barn," this is what they're talking about. And it's related to probability, to this roulette game that he's showing right here, 10 to the minus 28 square meters. Well, now granted, meter's a pretty big unit for atoms, but you're going to be sending a lot of neutrons, particles. Neutrons aren't the only way to do it. I think this video will get into it a bit later. But yeah, you're dealing with something with very low odds, but you're playing the game many, many, many times per second. So it's fascinating.
If you take 5 million spins at the roulette wheel, your odds go from basically impossible to just barely within the realm of possibility.
Yep.
Yeah, the odds are terrible, but
that's exactly
sooner or
what
later,
it
you're
is.
bound to get a hit. For element hunters, this means aiming a beam at a target and leaving it firing for literal months, which you can imagine gets very, very expensive. Depending on the lab and the type of beam,
I love this animation.
for just one day can cost somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars. A few months of beam time then
especially
is
back then,
easily in the millions of dollars. We have
beam
a lot
time.
of uranium on Earth, about 5.5 million metric tons, and even the shortest half-life is still 25,000 years. So getting a large enough uranium target to fire neutrons at isn't really a problem.
Yeah, uranium's uranium-238. That one has a half-life of about the same age as the Earth. So about half of the uranium's gone from whatever supernova, kilonova that ended up synthesizing uranium, because uranium's too heavy to make with nuclear fusion and stars naturally. You need even crazier stuff to pull that one off.
So making plutonium is easy enough. But then for the next level, your target needs to be plutonium. And then after that, it's curium, einsteinium, etc. Each time, your target's half-life is getting shorter and shorter. 1 gram of uranium costs about 13 cents. A gram of einsteinium costs about $27 million. Most casino goers can't afford that kind of buy-in. But in theory, if you've got unlimited time and unlimited money, element hunting gets a hell of a lot easier. Berkeley, situated in the richest state in the richest country in the world, had the most money and the best equipment, so no wonder they had the leg up. But that's the beauty of the casino. It was just a matter of time until another lab got lucky. While the Americans were busy building a bomb, the Soviets were
I love this
lagging
image as a
behind,
casino.
embarrassingly so. Admittedly, they were very occupied holding off the Germans on the Eastern Front and had focused all of their scientists on metallurgy. The Soviet nuclear program owes its start to one random volunteer lieutenant on the Eastern Front, Georgy Flerov. Prior to the war, he had been following the topic of nuclear fission quite closely, only for all publications to abruptly stop talking about it in 1939, of all years. He found this bizarre, as the ability to harness the power of an atom was like the most exciting thing to come out of physics in decades. He soon connected the dots. Oh my god, they're all making bombs. Flerov, against all conventional wisdom, wrote directly to Stalin and basically demanded that the Soviets devote as many resources as they could to nuclear technology. Flerov was, surprisingly, not punished for this insubordination, but
that's shocking, considering this is Stalin we're talking about, who probably wins the award for most paranoid, shoot the messenger type person in history.
Instead made a key player in the Soviet nuclear program. Following the war, however, Flerov changed his focus. He wanted to hunt elements. He founded JINR in Dubna, a small Russian town. Soon, it would be America versus the USSR in the hunt for elements.
Here we go, your classic Cold War setup.
Rival superpowers to help fight a Cold War? Never heard that one before. Couldn't be me. It's safe to say that nearly every new element from this point on would be hotly contested, and any and all evidence would be denied by either side. These were the Transfermium Wars, and here's how they went down. First,
I'm not as familiar with the historical aspect of this. This sort of stuff is fascinating. I love it.
a small lab in Sweden claims they found element 102. No you didn't, says Berkeley. Your equipment is cheap and bad and your test is not thorough enough. I agree, says Dubna, and then they both bullied Sweden until basically nobody believed Sweden had actually found anything. Berkeley tried some experiments of their own, which accidentally caused a radioactive dust spill that resulted in their lab being evacuated.
I like that it shows California versus all of Russia right there. Not the US, just California, Berkeley by itself.
And 27 people had nearly 3 months shaved off their average lifespan. Dubna then swoops in with...
That's a difficult... I'm not sure how you figure something like that. I guess you could look at, okay, contamination, how much dose they got from the incident. I don't know this incident specifically, And then you can calculate their increased odds of getting cancer, and you can somehow communicate some confidence interval with a range of life taking off. But that's a little out there. So remember when I said everything with nuclear physics is associated with probability? That includes the sort of things that can happen to you after getting a high dose. If you haven't already, please check out a reaction video I did for a guy who got a super high radiation dose and actually survived. I'll pin that in the comment below.
Even better results and claims 102 for their own. Then Dubna claimed 104, 103, and then 105, so fast that all the Americans could do was try and nitpick their data and make those same elements, but just better. It didn't help that each side had their own preferred types of evidence. To confirm a new element, the Soviets preferred using spontaneous fission. Their detectors were cheaper, and nuclei that split in half were big enough that they were guaranteed to detect something.
Talked a bit about spontaneous fission earlier in part 1, but it's kind of like a form of decay. It's kind of like alpha decay, except bigger. So you created something so big and even unstable, it needs to slough off even more of a proton-neutron bundle than a nice, stable alpha particle with 2 protons, 2 neutrons. It's really weird. Physically, it's the same sort of thing you get from a typical nuclear fission reaction that occurs in a nuclear reactor, kind of, but the way it happens is different. It's not your 1 neutron capture and then it splits. There's a bit more quantum tunneling involved in it too, so it's it's out there. So they're playing that high odds, they're playing that game of roulette, and they're hitting on something even smaller than what was talked about earlier in this video.
Americans called this unreliable, as you had no idea what was being split in half. They prefer to track alpha decay chains, the long line of elements feeding into one another. Because of this split in methodology, the data from this period is a mess to make sense of. Some of it was good, but dismissed by the other side because of bias. Some of it is straight up wrong, but was pushed out the door due to urgency. It's almost as if this sort of cutthroat competitive structure leads to
the Cold War.
I sure hope that doesn't come back to bite anyone. For now, the element hunt had stalled. I
think that might have been foreshadowing something.
You get up to element 102, your half-life is less than an hour. Before, you could rely on other dedicated labs to manufacture you enough of an element. They could ship it to you, and then you could start firing your beams at it. With a half-life of less than an hour, you couldn't even get a sample across town, much less an intercontinental flight. The quantities they were working with were getting smaller and smaller. When Berkeley claimed the discovery for curium, element 98, they did so after generating around 5,000 atoms of it. By the time they got to element 101, they had only created 17 atoms to claim the discovery. Soon enough, it was likely that any new elements would only be created 1 atom at a time. Singular atoms that would decay before another could join it. This clearly wasn't the end of the periodic table, but the element hunt was becoming too expensive and too impractical to continue, at least not without a breakthrough. Out of the 218 total winners, only 4 women have ever won the Nobel Prize in Physics. The first was Marie Curie all the way back in the ceremony's 3rd year, for her studies of radiation. She would be the only woman to hold this title for nearly 60 years. It wouldn't be until 1963 that Maria Goeppert-Mayer would break that trend. Like many of the pioneers of nuclear physics, Maria was an alumni of the Manhattan Project. After the war, she began studying elements and their half-lives, and what at first glance appeared to be random, soon she began to see patterns. Certain nuclei were reliably more stable than others. It was almost as if there was magic numbers of protons and neutrons. Maria visualized protons and neutrons as a set of dancers engaging in a waltz. The dancers are circling around the room.
That's awesome.
And spinning around on their feet. You can fit more dancers in the room if you pair them up, and by having adjacent pairs spinning in opposite directions.
Yes, spin is a little bit more out there. It's less of a literal terminology, but sure. It's one of those wave property sort of things rather than a physical spin, and elementary particles it's intrinsic with the type of elementary particle, such as, say, an electron. elementary particles such as an electron, up quarks, down quarks, photons. Note that protons and neutrons are not included into this because they can be subdivided further, hence the term elementary particle. But yeah, it's weird and probably worthy of another in-depth discussion.
Magic numbers of dancers fit more cleanly than others. In technical terms, this results in nuclei with a higher binding energy, which in turn gives a more stable nucleus. To date, the known magic numbers are 2, 8, 20, 28, 50, and 82. In element terms, that's helium, oxygen, calcium, nickel, tin, and lead. The critical way markers on the mountainous path.
Knew about helium and lead because those tend to come up more often, but the other ones, I'm sure I knew at some point and I just forgot. Because, yeah, when dealing with heavy elements, you always talk about them decaying to lead using alpha particles, and helium, of course, being the alpha particle in and of itself.
Stability. Notice that these magic numbers are all even. This demonstrates that protons and neutrons like to pair up to become more stable, like dancers pairing up for a waltz. Additionally, elements with a magic number of either protons or neutrons tend to be extremely abundant. And finally, at the end of a naturally occurring alpha decay chain, you will always find a stable element with a magic number. For an extra special example of this, take lead, the heaviest stable element. It's considered double magic, with both a magic proton number and a magic neutron number. There's a reason it is the very last step in the mountain path before you get to the Great Chasm. And the magic numbers theory had one last crazy prediction that gave the element hunters some hope. There was a magic island out in the middle of that sea. This island should be situated at 114 protons and 184 neutrons, right here. Make no mistake, this is not an island you could settle down on. You're still up to your neck in water, but your toes can just barely brush against the sand at the bottom. For just a moment, you can catch your breath before the tides of the sea will eventually come in and sweep you away again. And if this—
Loving this analogy. This is great.
True, maybe you didn't need to work your way up from the bottom, element by element. Maybe you could do it in reverse. Start at the edge of the cliff and launch yourself all the way to the island. From there, whatever element you made would likely decay into an alpha chain, and you generate all of the other elements on your way back down.
Seems efficient.
Element 106 marked a turning point in the element hunt. The last 4 elements were contested by both major sides, but element 106 was found and announced by Berkeley and Dubna the exact same month. For once, both teams agreed that it was too close to call. The tactics at this point had changed. Element 93 was made by slamming a neutron into uranium, the biggest possible target and the smallest possible bullet.
Yep.
By the 1980s, the thinking had changed. Why use an expensive radioactive target when you could use a much cheaper and much stabler target like lead? And instead of firing something small like helium, fire something medium-sized like chromium or iron.
What's interesting is just lead is used in a lot of these labs just in general because you're dealing with things like gamma radiation, and lead acts at, like, you put a bunch of lead bricks around it. On average, a typical gamma, you need about 8 inches of lead as protection from gamma radiation. I mean, it depends. You can have like ultra weak rays that can get stopped by like a few millimeters, and then you can have the ultra strong ones that you need like 1.5 feet. But usually 8 inches, you're good for most gammas, and they have all these lead bricks just strewn around. I remember having them in my lab in college. We do a bunch of experiments with radioisotopes. We didn't do anything fancy with crazy particle accelerator to try to make new elements or anything like that. This was a bit more fundamentals type stuff. Yeah, lead is very widely available, even already in laboratory settings. So it makes sense to use it for this sort of thing.
Lead has 82 protons. Iron has 26. 82 plus 26 is 108. Counterintuitively, this is actually more reliable than trying to get a single proton to join a massive nucleus. Nuclei closer in size balance each other out, and the resulting product doesn't eject nearly as many neutrons during the fusion process. Now, if this sounds too good to be true, yes, there is
fusion with lead and iron. I mean, here we're talking microscopic scales. Obviously, large scale, you need something with more energy than a star. But if we're just doing an experiment, close range, one at a time kind of dealio, sure, you're just playing again. You're doing the roulette with a really small target again.
Reason no one had tried this before. A source as heavy as iron would need an entirely new beam technology designed from the ground up.
That's true.
And a detector that was more sensitive than anything that had been invented yet. The Soviets were out of money and had no hope of going any further. And the Americans over in California had, for the first time, run out of ideas. The stage was set for Player 3. This is GSI.
Here we go,
Situated
Germany.
in Darmstadt in Western Germany, GSI had more than enough money to bankroll the new expensive equipment that the Soviet team couldn't afford, thanks to the post-war West German economic miracle. Their new beam could fire elements as heavy as chromium, iron, or even bismuth, all of which would hit a lead
Beam of
target.
iron,
Over
that's
the
a
course
little...
of just 5 years, this led to the discovery of 107, 109, and 108, in that order. For the first time, it was...
When I think of a beam of iron, I think of an I-beam of iron or steel used to make a building. That's just funny. I just picture them like smashing one of these beams into a target, and hey, there we get new elements. No, that's not how it works.
True three-way race in the element hunt: Berkeley, Dubna, and GSI. As the 1980s came to a close, there were 9 elements that needed official names. In comes IUPAC. Now, I once got into an argument with a commenter who claimed that IUPAC isn't actually the body that decides the names for the chemical elements. It's the scientists who come up with the names, but only in the same way that 6-year-old me totally got to choose my own bedtime and my mom had no say in the matter. IUPAC laid out the basic rule for what can be considered
Perfect
an element
analogy.
discovery. Namely, that an element must be stable enough to exist for more than 10 to the negative 14 seconds. It's
More than 10. How do you even? You can only measure that indirectly after it is long decayed away, because the reaction is just so fast. Even more modern computers, 10 to the minus 14 seconds. I mean, that's what even is that? What even goes that fast? Nuclear reactions are slower than that. A lot of them are on the order of, use the term shake. If you haven't watched a lot of my videos, a shake is 10 nanoseconds, but that's only 10 to the minus 8, so super slow relative to this sort of thing. So these are just blips.
time necessary for electrons to form a cloud around a nucleus. But IUPAC also had to choose who got to name which element. Otherwise, we'd have separate American and Soviet names for at least a dozen elements. And even in the rare cases where they could agree on a name, they couldn't agree on which element should get that name. At least 3 separate elements have, at some point, been referred to as Rutherfordium.
That's so funny. It's kind of like how you have the NATO and local designations of a lot of Soviet era equipment, from jets to helicopters to submarines to bombers, those sort of things. It would be funny if it's just like, hey, the periodic tables are just different depending on what country you're in, or whatever element you find in each country is just has a different name for it. Nah, that would be silly.
Would foolishly spend years trying to find a compromise that satisfied everyone, but eventually settled on a compromise that made everyone just slightly unhappy.
Slightly unhappy.
Among these new names, for the very first time, was that of a living scientist. Element 106 was called Seaborgium. The captain had left a permanent mark on the sea that he had traveled for most of his life.
Or that guy in the immigration office from the previous part of this made the impact, because he's the one who changed his name from Schoberg to Seaborg. That he didn't know how far that would go.
He passed away 2 years after the name was made official at the age of 86. It was a fitting end, because Seaborgium would be the last element discovered at Berkeley. The collapse of the Soviet Union hit the Dubna lab hard. The Russian economy was a garbage fire, and even its prestigious element hunting team wasn't immune to the fallout. For a while, it seemed doomed to close down. If you weren't Russian, you left the lab for your home country. If you were Russian, you left the lab for a private sector job where you'd actually have a salary. In the end, what saved it was renting out the accelerators to private companies and a partnership with the unlikeliest of allies. Livermore Labs in California also had an element hunting team, and the Russian team kept their lab alive.
Different California
forces. For the world, this was a good thing. But for Berkeley, this was yet another hurdle. Their fiercest rival had just teamed up with a fellow Californian lab. It would be outright petty to dispute any element claims that came out of such a partnership.
That's awesome.
Dubna Livermore first set their sights on element 110, the next in the sequence. But their attention soon shifted. They were about to attempt something that had only been dreamed of before this point. They were finally making that catapult. Their recipe was calcium-48 fired at plutonium-244. They're going to skip 3 whole rows and aim for element 114. And in 1998, it worked. 114 protons, but only 176 neutrons. Remember, the theoretical center of this island of stability was supposed to be over here, to the east, with 184 neutrons.
Missed it by a little bit.
This atom of 114 was in the realm of seconds. Not milliseconds, full seconds. The island of stability was real, and they had found the beginning of its shoreline. IUPAC wasn't entirely convinced. They wanted some more data, so the Russians kept at it. They'd work on trying to reproduce 114 more reliably, maybe even aim for 116 as well. The German team at GSI had other ideas. Although the country had suffered its own depression due to reunification, they got back on their feet much faster than Russia, and they had spent the last 5 years upgrading their equipment. But the lab at this point was being shared by several teams with competing projects. The main accelerator had a busy queue, and you'd often only get a few weeks with the accelerator before another team got priority. The element hunting team had already spent a few of their precious weeks calibrating the beam intensity, and now they only had 4 weeks left before the next team would bump them off the schedule. It was an extremely short window for this sort of experiment. The team decided to swap out the beam to fire nickel at lead. After just 1 day, they saw the first sign of element 110.
Wow.
They were unbelievably lucky. Their luck continued when they found out the next experiment was delayed by 17 days. So they kept at it. They swapped out the lead target for bismuth. Bam! 1 extra proton gave them element 111. 2 elements in just as many months. A year goes by and they try firing zinc at lead. At first they get a weird reading, but they keep going. In a little over a week, they find 112. The German team had once again done the unthinkable. A hat trick of 3 elements in a row.
That is so cool, and such a cool idea of just, I like the idea of, just shooting nickel or zinc or something that you would think of as like on the macro scale. I still think it's a funny idea, but it can't argue with results.
Move over, Berkeley. The crown has officially been lost. Berkeley at this point was nearly 20 years out from their last element discovery. The Russians were probing the island of stability, and the Germans were doing victory laps. They needed a secret weapon. And so, they orchestrated a coup. Enter, finally, Viktor Ninov. Physics doesn't often lend itself especially well to the idea of a rising star in the same way that music or film does. It's a glacially paced field of study that happens behind closed doors, and where it's hard to find a photo of someone that hasn't been JPEG'd into oblivion. But if physics did have a rising star, Viktor Ninov certainly fit the bill. Ninov was born in Bulgaria in 1959. As a young man, his family emigrated to West Germany. Ninov would go on to study physics at the Technical University of Darmstadt. Eccentric does not do Ninov justice. He regularly signed his emails with "You're crazy Bulgarian." He loved biking, and even played the violin. After he met his future wife, Carolyn Cox, she turned him into an avid hiker. He would often venture into the mountains with colleagues, and had even survived an avalanche accident that left him badly injured. His travels were not limited to the ground, however. He once sailed the Pacific Ocean on a 45-foot sailboat, and somehow he still had time to be a pilot, flying a single-engine, 4-seat Aero.
He seems like a crazy guy.
None of that holds a candle to my absolute favorite of his antics. He and a colleague were on a quest to visit every Italian restaurant in Darmstadt, where they would always order the spaghetti carbonara, and they would rank them all. Let me be absolutely clear. This is a grade A bit. I would also do this. This is so funny to me. A Bulgarian man ordering an Italian pasta dish from every restaurant in a German city. 0 notes on this. Besides being well liked by the entire...
Reminds me of those oddly specific world record entries. Like someone who, hey, I spun the basketball on a toothbrush for the longest amount of time, because no one else would think to do that.
team, he was also essential. In 1988, GSI upgraded their old computers, and Ninov took the lead on this. He was the go-to computer tech and even wrote a custom software package called Goosey. It was a one-of-a-kind, state-of-the-art software for analyzing decay chains of radioactive samples. Whereas before you had to manually look for analog detection spikes, element hunting had gone digital. He had found himself a niche in a field that is already filled with niche experts. And over the last 10 years, he was able to add a pretty sweet bullet point to his resume. Co-discoverer of elements 110, 111, and 112.
Wow.
So given all of this, it was an outright scandal when Berkeley headhunted him from GSI in 1996. The man who orchestrated this headhunt was a man well into his 80s. Al Ghiorso's story is a wild one. One day during the mid-1940s, he was installing an intercom system to the Berkeley lab and ended up meeting two secretaries. One of the women, Wilma Belt, would later become his wife. The other woman would later become the wife of Glenn Seaborg. Through this mutual friendship, Glenn recruited Al when he joined the Manhattan Project because Ghiorso was gifted as
I like how it's all
Geiger
connected,
count.
and he keeps
After
going
the
back
war,
to
when he
each
returned
square.
from Berkeley, Ghiorso was Seaborg's right-hand man, and they had been together for every element up until 101, when Seaborg left for his political appointment. That left Al Ghiorso as the de facto head of Berkeley's element hunting team. He was meant for this job. Let me paint you a picture. In the 1940s, Al Ghiorso supposedly held the world record for the longest range ham radio. He had extended his personal one so far, he could pick up stations in Ohio all the way out in California. He never collected the prize though because he was illegally operating without a radio license. Back when Berkeley had their accelerator on one end of the campus and the chemistry lab a mile up a hill, Ghiorso would jump into his Volkswagen Beetle and in the middle of the night race at illegal speeds up the Berkeley Hill so that they could get their sample tested before it decayed into nothing. Once he nearly ran over a security guard who pulled a gun on him, and he just kept driving. When Berkeley had their accidental radiation emergency when hunting element 102, it was Al who exited the building last after he calmly shut down the accelerator. Nearly half a century later, Al Ghiorso was the last remaining key figure from Berkeley's glory days. His second world record, a little more prestigious than his radio one, was for the most elements discovered. So when Al Ghiorso calls Viktor Ninov a young version of himself, you hire that man. Ghiorso was so excited that this brought him out of semi-retirement. Berkeley had a new rising star and an opportunity to be on top once again. With Ninov put in charge of the data analysis side, they needed someone to be in charge of the equipment end. That man was Ken Gregorich. He had overseen the construction of Berkeley's newest piece of tech, the Berkeley gas-filled separator. Now, they just needed a recipe. Dubna and Livermore had just made the claim for element 114. IUPAC wanted more data. Already months behind, Berkeley would have to act fast to try and scoop the element with a more convincing experiment, but they would have to use a different recipe than Dubna. Dubna had used plutonium-244 and calcium-48, neither of which Berkeley had enough of to run experiments. Also, the other problem is that the amount of required plutonium is actually illegal to use in a place as densely populated as the San Francisco Bay Area, so there was that thing. But they had yet another recent addition to the team who had another wild idea. Robert Smolenchuk was on a visiting scholarship from Poland. He was a theoretical physicist who had previously run some calculations that were mildly controversial. One colleague called his calculations simply mind-boggling. Robert was saying, skip everything from 113 to 117. Aim for 118. His plan was simple. Fire Krypton 86 at a lead 208 target, both of which are easy to acquire and, better yet, not radioactive. Now, conventional wisdom said that this recipe was too good to be true. Yeah, the protons add up to 118, but the probability of the reaction was thought to be near impossible. Not Robert, though. He had published a paper in which he showed calculations where this recipe was actually more likely to occur than others. Going back to the roulette analogy, element hunting is all about probability. You gotta consider what the odds of getting a hit are against the cost to keep the beam running for weeks. And to quantify this probability, physicists had come up with a delightfully silly unit of measurement. A barn is a unit that is somewhat of a hybrid between cross-sectional area and the probability of a collision between two particles. It quite literally comes from the phrase, couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Given its origin, one whole barn is considered a comically large target. as in it would be very difficult to miss a target of one barn. When it came to element hunting, the size of this target had been shrinking exponentially for decades. These days, reactions are measured in picobarns, trillionths of a barn.
Wow.
Take a look at this.
To give you a sense of scale, fissioning a uranium-235, which is very common in a nuclear power plant, we're talking about 500 barns. Not picobarns, actual barns, so it's a certainty.
On the horizontal axis, you see the atomic number of the element you're trying to create. And on the left-hand side is the estimated measure in barns. You'll notice that this is a logarithmic scale. As you go from element 102 to 110, the probability has gotten worse by a factor of nearly 10 million.
So here's where we get into the whole fusion thing. Yeah, fusion is so obscenely rare for heavy elements, which is why they only exist in nature through supernovas, kilonovas, ultra high amounts of energy, temperature of what it would take to get these sort of things to be produced in planetary-sized quantities, such as the amount of uranium that's on Earth. Now, hot fusion in particular. Now here we're just showing heavy elements, but it goes up significantly. It's way more easy to fuse lighter elements such as helium, hydrogen, than heavier elements such as what we're talking about with krypton and lead. But it's not zero. It can happen, but usually, at least when you're talking about mass production sort of thing, which is what I'm used to in terms of making power plants, you're not going to see these sort of fusion reactions used to produce energy in an economic means. In fact, you're losing energy in these reactions. This is just about a fun game to create new elements.
Diminishing returns. One thing you might notice, however, is the probabilities go up very slightly around element 114. This is one of the indications that the magic island of stability isn't just a mirage, and suggested that the Russian team were onto something. Now, element 118, though, that's a terrible barn measurement. Most recipes were predicting not even a single picobarn. When you get down to the picobarn level, if you have your beam running constantly, you might be able to produce one single atom a week, which you might not even detect. And you're out hundreds of thousands of dollars. Once you go below a picobarn, you'd be lucky to get even a single atom for an entire month's worth of beam time. And that's why Robert's recipe was so controversial. His paper argued that his recipe could give you 670 picobarns. If he was right, it would be a game changer. Not everyone was convinced, but the nice thing was that this recipe was low risk with a potentially high reward, and they needed a calibration test for the new machine anyway, so why not use Robert's magical recipe? No one was expecting an immediate breakthrough, and yet that's essentially what they got. The experiment began on April 8th of 1999. Most of the lab had left for Easter break. The one exception was Ninov, who stayed behind to analyze the results. 11 days later, the lab director, Darlene Hoffman, would get a phone call. Her first instinct was that it would be bad news. It had only been 11 days. Ken Gregorich assured her that it was quite the opposite. Darlene had every reason to assume the worst. Chemistry in the 40s was not a job intended for women. Darlene Hoffman had to wade through years of systemic discrimination to help change that.
Sure.
When her father passed away suddenly, she asked a professor if she could miss tomorrow's quantum chemistry test to plan the funeral. The professor made her do the test on the spot instead. This was, to use the industry term, horse shit. She wrote it with tears in her eyes. She still got a B. She persevered and finally got hired as a nuclear chemist at Los Alamos. But when she got there, she was told that women weren't hired to work in that division. While HR sat on their ass pretending to do anything, Darlene found her soon-to-be supervisor at a party who immediately fixed the situation. And then her security clearance magically went missing. Wow, that's weird. It took 3 more months before Darlene got access to the lab, and she had just narrowly missed out on what could have been a career highlight. Remember that atomic bomb that the fighter jets flew through? They went to Los Alamos, and because of bureaucratic nonsense, she missed out on being part of the team who discovered elements 99 and 100. A loss that filled her with rage that she funneled into her work. And now, as she entered her 70s, she was beloved by nearly every chemist that she came into contact with.
You know what? Good for her for This is such a fascinating story, and a lot of these more recent ones, I'm actually not too familiar with this side of the whole element hunting thing. It's a very different aspect of nuclear physics than what I've encountered throughout my career, but I've been thoroughly enjoying this ride. Really cool, kind of seeing people use fusion with the super heavy elements that are more common associated with fission reactors. It's very interesting to see, and it just seems like this crazy game that these people are playing, and with a lot of money, a lot of resources. I'm enjoying this so far. Please stay tuned for part 3. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.